You
I
don't
am
belong
not
here.
finished speaking.
People like
You
you should
are
never
finished.
sit at this table. The words
I am
cracked like a
not
whip
backing
inside the
down.
glass-walled boardroom. The man in his late 40s,
We both
silver
know
at his
that.
temples, leaned forward with one palm slamming the polished oak table. The sound echoed, rattling coffee cups and silencing the shuffle of papers.
This is
Every
just the
head
beginning
turned
of
toward
what
the
we can
target of his
achieve
fury.
together.
A black woman in her mid-30s, seated calmly at the far end. She wore a light grey suit, posture straight, arms folded across her chest. Her face was steady, unreadable. The man jabbed his finger toward her, voice dripping with contempt. "This is my company, my board, my house. You're just lucky to be here at all. People like you should know when to stay quiet." Gasps rippled through the room. A few of the shareholders, all seasoned professionals in their 40s and 50s, shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs. Some covered their mouths as they whispered. Others avoided eye contact. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now back to her. The man mistook her silence for weakness. He paced the floor like a wolf marking territory, Italian shoes clicking against marble. His voice boomed. "I don't care what title they gave you. I don't care what seat you sit in. People like me built this empire. People like you are only here to make it look good." He stopped inches from her chair, leaning down, his face red with anger. "Do yourself a favor. Get out, before I make you." He grabbed a thick folder from the table and flung it toward her, papers scattered like leaves in a storm, sliding across the table and onto the carpet at her heels. The room fell still. Phones lifted discreetly. A woman in her 40s angled her camera just above the table's edge, recording. Another man in his 50s muttered, "This is crossing the line." But she remained perfectly still, her gaze locked on him, eyes steady, arms still folded. Not a muscle twitched. The man straightened, scoffing at her silence. "Pathetic," he hissed. Then louder, "Get her out." But no one moved, no one dared. The only sound was the rustle of papers on the floor and the steady, calm rhythm of her breath. And in that silence, the power in the room began to shift. The papers still lay scattered across the boardroom carpet. No one bent to pick them up. No one dared to break the silence. The man in the navy suit stood over her like a conquering general, his chest heaving, his hand still raised as though his anger had nowhere else to land. But she didn't move. The woman in her mid-30s, the black executive everyone had underestimated, sat perfectly still. Light grey suit uncreased, arms folded neatly, her gaze locked forward. Her silence wasn't submission. It was defiance, sharpened into steel. Around the long mahogany table, the other board members fidgeted. Men and women in their 40s and 50s shifted in leather chairs, whispering behind cupped hands. "Why isn't she saying anything?" one hissed. "He's going too far," another muttered. A younger associate, though still past his 30s, slid his phone discreetly from his pocket, tilting it just enough to capture the scene. The tiny red dot of recording glowed in his reflection. He wasn't the only one. Across the room, a shareholder adjusted her glasses, her device angled toward the confrontation. The man in the suit smirked, mistaking the ripple of tension for support. "See," he barked. "No one disagrees. Everyone here knows I'm right." He jabbed a finger toward her again, voice laced with venom. "This seat, this company was never meant for you." She blinked once, slowly, deliberately. It was the only movement she allowed herself, and somehow it made the room lean closer. The power dynamic was shifting, and he didn't even realize it. A director in his early 50s coughed into his fist, uncomfortable. The assistant near the door shifted her weight, eyes darting nervously between the two. Even the secretary, seasoned, unshakable in her 40s, looked pale, her pen frozen above her notepad. The silence pressed heavier. Seconds stretched long now, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Finally the man snarled, slapping his palm against the table once more. "Say something," he demanded. "Defend yourself if you dare." But she didn't. She sat still, her arms crossed, her posture unyielding. Every beat of silence tightened the coil around the room. The hush was louder than his shouting, more dangerous than his rage. Someone whispered, "She's not afraid." Another answered, "She's waiting." And they were right. Her silence was not the silence of retreat. It was the silence of strategy. A pause sharpened into a blade. The man stepped back, shaking his head in disbelief. He turned to the others, searching for agreement, for nods, for validation. But what he found were averted eyes and lifted phones. The tide was turning, and he couldn't stop it. And still she said nothing. The stillness became unbearable, suffocating the bravado out of the room. Everyone knew. The storm hadn't passed. It hadn't even started. The silence unsettled him. What should have been victory felt hollow. His words were supposed to sting, to draw fire, to make her break. Yet here she sat, unshaken, arms crossed, gaze steady. He clenched his jaw, stepping closer until his shadow stretched across the polished table. "Do you think ignoring me makes you stronger?" he snapped. "It makes you small, pathetic. You don't belong in this chair, in this room, in this world of ours." The insult slashed sharper this time. It wasn't just dismissal, it was erasure. Around the table, the witnesses bristled. A woman in her early 40s shifted uncomfortably, her hands tightening around her pen. The associate still recording swallowed hard, the red light on his phone blinking steadily. From the corner, a director in his late 50s whispered, "This is getting ugly." The man's voice rose, fueled by his own arrogance. He circled the table like a wolf closing in. "Do you know what happens to people like you when they overreach? They fall. And when they fall, they're forgotten." Gasps flickered across the room. The words carried more than disdain, they carried threat. He leaned in close, inches from her face, his breath hot with contempt. "Say something. Defend yourself. Or admit what everyone already knows. You're not fit to sit here." But she didn't flinch. Her expression remained calm, her silence louder than his venom. The steady rise and fall of her breath was the only answer she gave. Whispers rustled like wind through leaves. One shareholder murmured to another, "Why won't she speak?" The reply came quiet, tense, "Because she doesn't have to." The man slammed his hand on the table again, rattling water glasses. "You think your silence protects you? It doesn't. It exposes you. Everyone sees it. Weakness clear as day." But the truth was different. Everyone did see it, just not the way he imagined. They saw a man unraveling, his face flushed red, sweat prickling at his brow, voice cracking with desperation. They saw a woman unmoved, steady as stone, her silence turning into a mirror that reflected his insecurity back at him. The waitress outside, who had entered quietly with a tray for refreshments, froze mid-step. Early 30s, observant eyes, she glanced between the two, lips parting slightly as if she knew this silence was heavier than any spoken word. The man mistook her hesitation as support. He turned, gesturing wildly toward her. "Even she sees it. Even she knows you don't belong." But the waitress said nothing. She lowered her eyes, retreating toward the door, unwilling to be used as his weapon. The room buzzed now with unease. Phones tilted higher. The narrative was shifting, and the man couldn't see it. He jabbed his finger at the black woman again, voice thundering. "Admit it, this is too big for you. You're out of your depth, and everyone here knows it." Still she sat. Still she breathed. Still she refused to give him the outburst he craved. And in her silence, the storm gathered strength. Everyone in the room could feel it. The breaking point was near. The boardroom was no longer just a meeting space. It had become a stage, and every shareholder, every assistant, every pair of eyes older than 29 was part of the audience. The man in the navy suit still loomed, voice dripping venom, yet it was no longer the center of attention. The true focus had shifted. It rested on her, the black executive in her mid-30s, seated, still, silent, unmoved. Whispers crept along the table. A woman in her early 40s leaned toward the colleague beside her. "He's losing it," she murmured. The colleague, late 50s, gave a curt nod. "And she hasn't said a word." That's power. Phones tilted higher. At least 4 cameras now recorded, their screens glowing discreetly in trembling hands. The small red dots blinked like fireflies, capturing every insult, every slam of the table, every arrogant jab of his finger. The man didn't notice. Or maybe he didn't care. His pride blinded him. He continued pacing the length of the table, hands slicing the air as he raged. "You sit there like you're untouchable, but everyone in this room knows the truth. You don't belong in my company." His words echoed, but his audience had shifted. They weren't nodding in agreement. They were watching with unease, with disgust, with a new awareness of where the true imbalance lay. Near the back, the secretary in her 40s set her pen down, the ink blotting against paper. She pressed her lips together, whispering to herself, "This is going to end badly for him." The waitress, still holding her tray near the door, shifted uneasily. Her eyes locked on the silent woman at the table. Something in that composure steadied her nerves, as if she too drew strength from the stillness. The man's anger swelled louder. He slammed the back of a chair, rattling its frame. "Look at you!" "Sitting there, pretending to be equal, pretending you have a place here. You're nothing compared to me." The gasps came louder now, no longer whispers. One director muttered under his breath, "He's finished." Another leaned back, arms folded, phone recording openly now. Every insult he hurled bounced off her calm like arrows striking stone. And in each ricochet the witnesses saw more clearly. The strength wasn't in his noise, it was in her silence. She shifted slightly, crossing one leg over the other. The movement was small, almost casual, but in the silence of the boardroom it thundered like a declaration. "I'm not going anywhere." The man froze for a second, thrown by her composure. Then, desperate, he turned to the room, gesturing wildly. "Why are you all just sitting there? You agree with me, don't you? Tell her she doesn't belong." But the room stayed quiet. Phones kept recording. Eyes darted away. The silence that had once felt heavy on her shoulders now pressed on his. For the first time his voice cracked. "Say something," he barked, but the plea fell flat, brittle, powerless. The whispers had already chosen their side, and they weren't whispering for him. The silence of the room had turned against him. What once felt like control now burned into his skin like a spotlight. Dozens of eyes, dozens of phones, dozens of breaths held, and none of them on his side. The man in his late 40s felt it slipping. Authority, respect, the illusion of power. Desperation clung to him, sticky and loud. He slammed his fist onto the stack of documents at the center of the table. Charts, contracts, balance sheets, all the paper that represented months of work, quivered under the blow. He grabbed the pile, lips curling into a sneer. "You think you're untouchable?" he spat. His voice cracked, raw with arrogance. "Let me show you just how little you mean here." And with one violent motion, he swept the entire stack into the air. Pages flew like a storm, fluttering across the polished oak, scattering onto the carpet, drifting into the laps of stunned shareholders. Gasps exploded around the room. A woman in her early 40s clutched the papers against her chest as if they were proof of something larger. Another man in his 50s let them fall at his feet, his jaw tightening in disgust. The waitress at the door flinched, the tray rattling in her hands. The black woman at the center of it all, calm, mid-30s, the one he targeted, remained unmoved. She sat with arms still folded, eyes steady, the storm of paper swirling around her like a crown of chaos she refused to acknowledge. The man leaned forward across the table, both palms slamming down. "This is my company," he growled, his voice cracking with the weight of rage. "And no amount of silence, no amount of arrogance will change that. You will always be less than me." The words landed heavy, sharp, cruel. They were meant to cut, to bruise, to reduce her in the eyes of everyone present. But the effect was the opposite. Every insult, every slammed fist, every scattered sheet of paper painted him smaller, weaker, unraveling before their eyes. And every second of her calm painted her larger, steadier, a storm contained in silence. A shareholder in his 50s shook his head, muttering under his breath, "He's lost it." Another early 40s raised her phone higher, no longer hiding the recording. The tide was not just turning, it had already turned. He didn't notice. Or maybe he refused to. He shoved the last remaining folder off the table, papers spilling onto the floor at her feet. "Pick it up," he snarled. "Pick it up and admit you don't belong here." Her eyes lifted slowly, finally locking onto his. For the first time that night, there was movement. Not words, but the faintest curve of her lips, a smile so small it was almost invisible. And in that moment, the room knew. She wasn't the one being humiliated. He was. Papers littered the carpet like fallen leaves. The man stood over them, chest heaving, face flushed, convinced he had won the room. His voice echoed in his own ears, feeding his illusion. But the illusion cracked when she finally moved. The black woman in her mid-30s, silent until now, calm even in humiliation, lowered her arms from their folded position. Slowly, deliberately, she reached into the sleek leather case beside her chair. The sound of the zipper slicing open cut through the heavy silence. Every head turned. Every phone camera tilted closer. From the case, she drew out a slim silver laptop. Her fingers, steady and unhurried, placed it onto the polished oak table as if she had all the time in the world. She opened it with a soft click. The glow of the screen lit her face, calm and controlled. The man barked a laugh, sharp and ugly. "What's this? You're going to Google your way into relevance? Pathetic." He spread his arms wide, addressing the shareholders. "You see, this is all she has, a toy, a distraction." But the room didn't laugh with him. They leaned forward instead, eyes drawn to her screen. Her fingers glided across the keyboard. The projector mounted in the ceiling came alive, casting a large luminous image onto the wall behind her. Numbers, graphs, documents stamped with official seals, shareholding percentages, control stakes, voting power. Gasps rippled through the boardroom. Phones captured every pixel. She didn't look at the man. She didn't need to. Her voice, clear and measured, filled the space for the first time that night. "Before you decide who belongs here," she said evenly, "perhaps you should check who this company truly belongs to." The man's smirk faltered. His eyes darted to the glowing screen. There it was, undeniable. Her name, highlighted in bold, beside the largest block of ownership shares. A controlling stake, the kind of power that silences boardrooms. Murmurs surged like a rising tide. A shareholder in his late 50s leaned back in his chair, stunned. "It's her. She owns it." Another whispered, "All this time." The waitress at the door pressed a hand against her chest, relief flooding her features. The man tried to recover, shaking his head furiously. No, this doesn't mean anything. Numbers can be twisted, But no one was listening. All eyes were on her, standing now, illuminated by the data she had unleashed. Calm, certain, unmoved by his rage, untouched by his insults. Her silence had been her shield, her evidence was now the sword, and the first cut had been made. The projection glowed like a beacon on the boardroom wall. Line after line of data stretched wide across the screen. Shareholder breakdowns, majority blocks, voting rights. And at the very top, highlighted in crisp digital blue, was her name. The black woman in her mid-30s stood tall beside the glowing wall, hands resting lightly on the table. Her posture was steady, commanding without a shout. The room leaned in, almost pulled forward by gravity. Shareholders in their 40s and 50s squinted at the figures, whispering under their breath. Phones recorded feverishly, capturing every detail. A director in his late 40s adjusted his glasses, voice low but sharp. "She has majority control." Another, older, muttered, "She doesn't just belong here, she runs this." The man in the navy suit staggered backward a step, his confidence shaken. His face, once flushed with arrogance, drained pale under the cold light of numbers he could not argue with. He tried to muster a scoff. "This is smoke and mirrors, a trick." But the numbers stayed undeniable, unflinching. Her voice, calm and deliberate, sliced through the tension. "Every share you see here has been accounted for. Every transaction verified. There is no trick, no illusion, just truth." The murmurs grew louder. A woman in her 40s leaned closer to her neighbor. "All this time he's been barking, and she's the one holding the leash." The waitress near the door set her tray aside, her shoulders easing for the first time that night. She whispered under her breath, "Finally." The man's fists clenched at his sides. He pointed at the screen, voice cracking. "This means nothing if no one believes it." But the irony was cruel. Everyone did believe it. They saw it with their own eyes. And worse for him, they were recording it. Phones tilted higher, capturing both her calm figure and the glowing evidence behind her. This was no longer just a boardroom argument. It was testimony, preserved in dozens of angles, ready to echo far beyond these walls. Her gaze swept slowly across the room, meeting eyes, steady and unyielding. "Respect is not given, it is earned," she said softly. "But ownership is documented." The words landed like a verdict. Silence spread again, but this time it was different. It wasn't her silence against his rage. It was the silence of recognition, the silence of power realigning. The man swallowed hard. He was losing them, losing everything, and he knew it. She turned her eyes back to the wall, where her name glowed like a seal. Calmly she added, "You wanted proof. Now you have it." And in that instant the boardroom shifted. She was no longer the target. She was the authority. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound in the boardroom was the faint hum of the projector, casting its cold blue glow over a room full of stunned faces. The black woman in her mid-30s stood calm, her figure outlined against the wall of numbers. Her silence had been armor, but now her evidence was fire, burning away every doubt. A director in his early 50s leaned back in his chair, eyes wide, lips parting as though he had seen a ghost. "She's the majority holder," he whispered, but his voice carried anyway. Across the table, a woman in her 40s clutched the armrest of her chair, shaking her head slowly. "I didn't see it coming," she muttered. "All this time." The waitress near the door, tray now abandoned, pressed her palms together in front of her lips, eyes wide with relief. She mouthed the words, "She owns it." Phones continued recording, some now raised openly. Shareholders leaned closer, capturing her against the glow of her undeniable power. Screens caught the lines of her name, the hard evidence of ownership, the truth no insult could erase. The man in the navy suit staggered backward another step, his confidence crumbling with every whisper. No, this can't be right," he stammered, sweat forming at his temple. He tried to laugh, a desperate, hollow sound. "She's tricked you. She's tricked all of you." But his words didn't stick. A shareholder in his late 50s, known for his stoic silence, finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "No one tricks the math," he said. Heads nodded around the room. The murmurs grew, a chorus of disbelief turning into recognition. "She's in control," one whispered. "It was her all along," another said. "Everything changes tonight." The man's eyes darted from face to face, searching for allies, but none came. He saw phones raised, pens frozen above paper, eyes wide not with loyalty but with awe, and not for him, for her. Her calm voice rose again, measured and even. "The truth doesn't need defense," she said, her gaze fixed firmly on him. "It only needs time, and tonight the time has come." The room froze under her words. The tension had transformed. What once felt like her trial now felt like his judgment. The waitress blinked back tears, her voice barely a whisper. "Finally, someone who doesn't have to scream to win." The man's bravado crumbled further. His lips moved, but the words stumbled. This is still my company," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. But no one believed him. The boardroom, once his stage, now belonged to her, and everyone present knew it. The projector's glow bathed the room in cold blue light. For nearly an hour she had been silent, stone against the storm, calm against the chaos, but now, for the first time, her voice rose, smooth and steady, slicing through the heavy air. "Before you decide who belongs," she began, her tone even and deliberate, "perhaps you should look at who truly owns this company." Every head turned. Even those who had already read the numbers on the screen leaned closer, compelled by the quiet authority in her words. The black woman in her mid-30s stood tall, her hands resting lightly on the table. Her gaze swept the room, meeting each shareholder's eyes in turn. There was no tremble, no hesitation, only certainty. Across from her, the man in the navy suit froze. His jaw hung open, disbelief painted across his face. For the first time, he realized the silence had not been weakness. It had been patience, strategy. She continued. "Respect, as I said, is earned. But ownership is written. Ownership is signed. Ownership is recorded for all to see." Her hand gestured to the glowing projection, her name bold against the charts. "And the record is clear." Gasps broke the stillness. A woman in her early 40s whispered, "She's not defending herself. She's declaring her power." A man in his 50s nodded slowly, eyes narrowing with newfound respect. The waitress near the door clutched the tray against her chest, her lips parting in awe. The man in the suit tried to interrupt, his voice trembling. This doesn't mean you belong here. You'll never have what I have." But his words fell flat, brittle against her composure. She turned her gaze on him, her voice lowering but growing sharper. "What you had was noise. What you had was arrogance. But what I have, what I will always have, is the truth." The weight of her words pressed down on the room like a gavel. She stepped closer to the table, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. Her presence filled the space, not with volume, but with gravity. "For years, men like you believed you could shout others out of their place. But the truth doesn't shout, it doesn't rage, it waits." She paused, letting the silence settle before delivering the final blow. "And tonight, the truth speaks." Phones recorded furiously. Shareholders exchanged glances, the whispers growing into a tide of recognition. The man's face reddened, but no one came to his defense. The tide had turned completely. This was no longer his room, it was hers. The boardroom was no longer a battlefield of insults. It had become a courtroom, and the verdict was about to be read aloud. Behind her, the projection blazed brighter as she tapped a key on her laptop. The screen shifted from dry charts to official documents, notarized filings, stamped contracts, dated transfers, and at the bottom of each page, in crisp black ink, her signature. Gasps rippled across the room. A shareholder in his late 50s leaned forward, squinting. That's her name. Another, a woman in her 40s, clapped her hand to her mouth. She's the controlling shareholder. The words spread like fire, whispered from one to the next until the whole room buzzed with shock. The black CEO, mid-30s, calm and resolute, raised her eyes from the screen to the crowd. Her voice was soft, but it carried. For those who still doubt, look closely. These are not projections. These are filings. Verified, recorded. She clicked again, and the numbers crystallized. 52%. A majority stake. More than all others combined. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the hum of the projector seemed to fade under the weight of the revelation. The man in the navy suit staggered backward, shaking his head as if the force of denial could erase the truth. "No, this isn't possible," he stammered. His hand clutched the back of a chair as though he needed its support to stand. "This has to be forged. A mistake. A lie." But the evidence glowed too bright. Screens around the room captured every frame, every line, every number. The witnesses weren't just seeing it, they were preserving it. One shareholder in his 40s raised his phone higher, speaking loudly enough for all to hear. "This is history. Everyone will know." The waitress near the door whispered under her breath, eyes shining, "She owns it all." The black CEO let the whispers swell before speaking again. Her tone was even, almost gentle, but it carried the weight of a hammer. "For years you believed power was yours because you shouted the loudest, but power doesn't live in noise, it lives in truth, and truth leaves a record." She turned her gaze directly on him. "Here's the record." The room erupted. Gasps, murmurs, the hurried tapping of fingers capturing screenshots. The shareholders' faces shifted from doubt to awe, from hesitation to recognition. The man stumbled again, his voice cracking. You can't do this." But no one was listening to him anymore. Because the room knew. The company was hers, the power was hers, and nothing he could say would change it. The numbers glowed mercilessly on the screen, 52%. A simple figure, but it weighed like a mountain. No insult, no denial, no tantrum could erase it. The man in the navy suit, late 40s, once towering in arrogance, looked suddenly small. His shoulders sagged, his eyes darting from face to face, searching desperately for someone to nod, someone to agree, someone to save him. But no one moved. Phones remained raised, red recording dots blinking like silent witnesses. Shareholders in their 40s and 50s leaned back, arms folded, their expressions a mix of shock and quiet satisfaction. The same people who once stayed silent under his bullying now sat in judgment. His voice cracked. You can't let this stand," he pleaded, but the words had no weight. They fluttered to the ground like the papers he had thrown earlier, ignored and meaningless. The black CEO, mid-30s, poised and unwavering, stood tall at the head of the table. She didn't gloat, she didn't sneer, she simply watched, her silence sharper than any insult. A woman in her early 40s broke the hush, whispering to her colleague, "He's finished." The man beside her, late 50s, nodded slowly. He was finished the moment she walked in. The waitress near the door wiped her palms against her apron, her chest rising with relief. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "Dignity always wins." The man stumbled, grabbing the back of a chair for balance. His face was pale now, drained of the colour that arrogance once painted. His hands shook. It's not how it's supposed to be," he muttered, his voice small, pitiful. The shareholders' eyes turned, one by one, from him to her, and in those gazes the transfer of power was complete. No longer whispers, no longer hesitation, only recognition. The room that once felt like his domain now felt like her courtroom. And she hadn't needed to raise her voice once. She finally spoke, her tone quiet, firm, unshakable. "Respect is lost in moments, power collapses in arrogance, but truth endures." The words landed like a gavel striking wood. The man's knees buckled slightly. He lowered himself into a chair, defeated, his head in his hands. No one reached out to him. No one offered comfort. He was alone. Meanwhile, the silence around her transformed. It wasn't the tense silence of earlier, it was reverent, heavy with respect. The board members watched her not as an outsider, not as an intruder, but as what she truly was, the one in charge. And in that moment, arrogance died. Authority was reborn. The boardroom was unrecognizable. The storm that began with shouts and insults had ended in silence so profound it felt sacred. The man in the navy suit sat slumped in his chair, his face buried in his hands. The towering arrogance that once filled the room had collapsed into dust. His voice was gone, his authority stripped bare in front of everyone who mattered. And at the center stood the black CEO, mid-30s, calm, unbroken, radiant in quiet power. The projection behind her still glowed, her name emblazoned above the figure, 52% like a seal of truth no one could deny. She closed her laptop with a soft click, the sound echoing through the chamber. It wasn't loud, but it carried finality. A gavel's strike, a curtain call. Her eyes swept the room, meeting each gaze with calm certainty. Directors in their 40s and 50s straightened under her look, not out of fear, but respect. The waitress near the door clutched her tray tightly, tears glistening in her eyes, whispering, "She did it." The CEO's voice rose, clear and deliberate. Tonight was never about noise. It was never about who could shout the loudest. It was about truth. And the truth doesn't need permission to exist. It simply stands. She paused, letting the words sink deep into the silence. Then she added, softer but sharper than steel, "And tonight it stands with me." For a heartbeat, the room held still. Then, as if on cue, chairs shifted, hands came together, and applause thundered through the boardroom. It started slow, hesitant, then built into a wave. Phones captured the moment, flashes of light recording the history unfolding before their eyes. The man in the chair didn't look up. He couldn't. But she didn't glance at him either. He was no longer relevant. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor as she walked toward the exit. The crowd parted naturally, a corridor of respect forming as she moved through. Applause followed, echoing off glass walls and polished oak, filling the space with something larger than celebration. It was recognition. At the door she paused only once, turning her head slightly to the room behind her. Her expression remained calm, unreadable, but her presence alone spoke volumes, dignity reclaimed, justice delivered. Then she stepped out, the door closing softly behind her. Inside the boardroom, the applause lingered like a verdict. The man had lost his voice, but she had given the truth its own, and tonight the truth had won.